The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light flooded the observation deck of the flagship Voronth, and every officer around me froze for exactly 1 second too long. 1 second is a long time when something is moving fast enough to end your life before your brain finishes processing the warning. My name is Vexthal Orim, and I was the only person on that bridge who was not surprised by what happened next. I had been trying to warn my superiors for 6 years. Nobody listened. Now the proof was tearing through our hull deck by deck, and there was nothing left to do but watch. I need to take you back before I tell you how that day ended, because you will not understand the horror of it unless you understand the arrogance that led us there. I worked as an intelligence analyst for the Korvan Trade Compact, a coalition of 9 species that had, between us, controlled trade and territory across a third of the settled galaxy for over 11,000 years. We were old. We were proud. We had fought wars with beam weapons that could melt a moon, shields that could shrug off a small star's worth of radiation, and fleets so vast that no single power had dared challenge us in over 2,000 years. When the humans arrived on the galactic stage, barely a century after developing faster-than-light travel, most of the compact treated them the way you might treat a child who has just learned to walk, something to be tolerated, occasionally patronized, and never, ever feared. I still remember the first briefing where humanity came up as a topic. It was held in a wide chamber with curved glass walls overlooking the trade spires of Korvan Prime, and the presenting officer, a stout Threll bureaucrat named Doran Vesk, clicked through images of human ships with open amusement in his voice. "Look at this," he said, gesturing at a boxy human cruiser with plating so thick it seemed almost comical next to our sleek, energy-shielded vessels. No deflector array, no plasma cannons. Their entire military doctrine appears to be built around throwing metal at things very fast. The room laughed. I laughed too, if I am honest, because at the time I did not know any better. We all assumed that any species without shield generators and beam weapons was still climbing out of its technological infancy, and we assumed it because we had never lost a war to anyone who thought differently. My own specialty was pattern analysis. I spent my days combing through sensor logs, trade disputes, border skirmishes, anything that might reveal how a rival power thought and fought. It was tedious work most of the time, but it taught me to notice things other analysts overlooked, because I was trained to ask not what a weapon looked like, but what it was built to do. And the more human data crossed my desk, the more uneasy I became. Their ships had almost no offensive energy signature. Their sensor profiles showed massive onboard power reserves with no matching weapon system to explain the draw. Their military exercises, on the rare occasions our listening posts caught fragments of them, showed firing solutions calculated for targets that were not stationary, not slow, and not remotely close. I flagged this in a report titled Anomalies in Human Combat Doctrine, and I sent it up through 6 layers of command. It came back 3 weeks later with a single line attached from a senior analyst named Coram Beth. Interesting theory. Insufficient evidence. Recommend reassignment to trade route analysis. That was the first time the compact told me, without quite saying it, that it did not want to hear what I had to say. It would not be the last. The real warning, the one that should have changed everything, came 18 months later, and it came from an incident so small that most people in the compact never even heard about it. A Korvan Border Patrol corvette named the Ilvath was assigned to investigate unauthorized mining activity near a disputed asteroid field on the edge of human expansion space. The Ilvath was not a warship exactly, but it carried shielding rated to withstand a direct hit from an antimatter warhead, technology so advanced that no minor skirmish in living memory had come close to breaching it. Its captain, a cautious and by all accounts skilled officer named Prin Ashal, approached the mining site with standard hailing protocols, expecting at worst a tense negotiation with human contractors over territorial boundaries. What the sensor logs showed instead, when investigators finally reviewed them, was almost impossible to believe. There was no warning flash, no buildup of energy that our systems could detect. One moment, the Ilvath's shields were reading at full strength, and in the next fraction of a second, something crossed the distance between a human mining platform and the corvette so quickly that the ship's sensors did not even register a moving object until after the impact had already occurred. The shields, rated to stop a warhead, were punched through as if they were not there at all. The strike tore through 3 decks before the ship's automated systems could even log a threat alert. 11 crew members were lost. The Ilvath survived only because the strike missed the reactor core by a matter of meters. When the incident report crossed my desk, I felt something cold settle into my chest, because I recognized it immediately for what it was. This was not a fluke. This was not debris, or a rogue asteroid fragment, or a sensor malfunction, all of which were suggested at various points during the official inquiry. This was a weapon, deliberately fired, that had punched through our best defensive technology, like it was made of wet paper. I wrote a second report. I called it the Ilvath Incident, a warning we cannot afford to ignore. I laid out the math as clearly as I could, showing that an object with no detectable energy signature had struck with the destructive force of a small warhead, and that the only plausible explanation was kinetic weaponry accelerated to a velocity far beyond anything in the compact's arsenal. I proposed that human ships were equipped with mass drivers, what some old records called railguns, weapons that used electromagnetic force rather than chemical propellant, or energy beams to launch solid projectiles at speeds that made conventional shielding almost meaningless. The response from the review board was polite, dismissive, and final. They thanked me for my diligence. They noted that kinetic weapons had been considered and abandoned by every major spacefaring power thousands of years ago, precisely because energy shielding had rendered them obsolete. They suggested, gently but unmistakably, that I was allowing my imagination to outpace the evidence, and that the Ilvath had most likely suffered a shield harmonic failure combined with a debris strike, an explanation that required no fewer than 3 separate coincidences to be true. I remember sitting alone in my office that night, staring at the report with my name on it, wondering how an entire civilization could look directly at the truth and choose, instead, to believe something far less likely, simply because it was more comfortable. I was not the only one who saw it. That is the part of this story that still makes my hands tremble when I think about it too long. Across the other compact species, quiet, cautious voices were raising the same alarm, and every single one of them was met with the same wall of denial. A Threll logistics officer named Doran Vesk, the very same one who had laughed at the human ships in that first briefing, later authored his own memo after a separate human encounter, left a supply convoy with 2 ships destroyed, and no clear cause identified. His memo, like mine, vanished into the bureaucracy. A Sinai fleet strategist, whose name I only learned much later, tried to bring the issue before the Joint Compact Council, and was quietly removed from his post for what his superiors called excessive speculation, damaging to diplomatic relations. 3 species, 3 warnings, 3 dismissals. It was not a coincidence. It was a pattern, and the pattern had a name, though none of us wanted to say it out loud. The pattern was denial, wearing the mask of confidence. I want you to understand something about the culture I grew up in, because it explains everything that followed. For 11,000 years, the Compact's military doctrine had been built on a single, unshakable assumption, that the pinnacle of warfare was energy, beam weapons that could vaporize armor in an instant, shield generators that could deflect anything a beam weapon could throw. Kinetic weapons, the old solid projectile guns that ancient pre-spaceflight civilizations had once used to fight their primitive wars, were considered a relic, something you saw in museums, next to gunpowder rifles and iron swords. Every military academy in the Compact taught the same history, that kinetic warfare had been rendered obsolete the moment shielding technology matured, because no solid object, however fast, could carry more destructive force than a focused beam of coherent energy. And shields were specifically designed to disperse exactly that kind of energy. It was, in a very real sense, a law of physics as far as our culture was concerned. Except it was not a law of physics at all. It was a habit of thought, and habits of thought are far more dangerous than any weapon, because they blind you to the exact thing that is about to kill you. Humanity, as it turned out, had looked at the same history we had and drawn the opposite conclusion. Instead of chasing ever more elegant energy weapons, they had returned to the oldest, simplest idea in the history of warfare, that a sufficiently fast, sufficiently heavy object will go through almost anything in its path, and no amount of clever engineering can change that basic truth if you cannot detect it coming in time to respond. They had spent decades, maybe longer, perfecting electromagnetic acceleration technology until they could launch a solid metal slug at a fraction of the speed of light, with almost no energy signature to give away the shot before it landed. It was not a new idea. It was the oldest idea in the book, taken further than anyone else had bothered to take it, because everyone else had assumed it was not worth taking anywhere at all. I tried, again and again, to make people understand this. I remember one meeting in particular, held in the same glass-walled chamber where I had first heard humans mocked, nearly 4 years after the Ilvath incident. I stood before a panel of senior officers, including Coram Beth, the analyst who had dismissed my very first report, and I laid out every piece of evidence I had gathered. Sensor anomalies, damage patterns inconsistent with any known energy weapon, testimony from surviving crew members who described impacts with no warning flash, no heat signature, nothing but a sudden and catastrophic silence followed by destruction. Coram listened with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, and when I finished, he asked me a single question. If humans truly possessed weapons capable of piercing compact shielding at these ranges, why have they not used this advantage to expand aggressively into our territory? It is a fair question, and at the time I did not have a good answer for it, though I understand now, far better than I wish I did, exactly why they waited. They waited because they were patient in a way our culture had never learned to be. They watched us dismiss every warning, ignore every incident, and grow more confident in our own superiority with each passing year, and they let us do it, because every year we spent laughing at them was another year they spent refining their technology and understanding exactly how we thought, how we fought, and how we would react when the moment finally came. I did not know this at the time, of course. None of us did. All I knew was that I was watching my own civilization walk, eyes open, directly into something it refused to see, and no report, no evidence, no amount of pleading was going to change that, because the compact had built its entire identity around the belief that it could not be surprised by a species it considered beneath it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being right about something terrible and having no one believe you. I felt it every day for 6 years. I felt it when my colleagues stopped inviting me to strategy discussions because I had become, in their eyes, obsessed with a threat that did not exist. I felt it when my request for further investigation into human weapon signatures was formally denied for the 4th time. This time with a note suggesting I consider a transfer to a less demanding department for the sake of my own well-being. I felt it most of all in the quiet moments, late at night, when I would pull up the Ilvath sensor logs one more time and watch that impossible strike happen again and again, trying to understand what I was looking at, and knowing, with a certainty that made my stomach twist, that somewhere out among the stars, humanity was watching us just as closely as I was watching them, and drawing far more accurate conclusions than we were. I did not know, on that ordinary morning years later when I boarded the flagship Voranth as an official observer, that I was about to see everything I had warned about happen at once, on a scale so much larger than the Ilvath, that the earlier incident would seem, in hindsight, like nothing more than a whisper before a storm. I did not know that the same officers who had dismissed my reports would be standing beside me on that bridge, confident to the very last moment, right up until the instant that confidence became something closer to horror. I did not know any of that yet. All I knew, as I walked up the boarding ramp that day, was that the compact was finally sending a fleet toward human space, and that whatever happened next, I intended to be there to see it, because after 6 years of being ignored, some quiet, stubborn part of me needed to know if I had been right all along. I would learn the answer sooner than I ever wanted to. The Ilvath was not the only warning we received, and it was certainly not the last. Once I began looking for the pattern, I found it everywhere, hidden in reports that had been filed and forgotten, buried under bureaucratic language designed to make anomalies sound like nothing at all. I want to walk you through what I found, because it explains something crucial about how a civilization as advanced as ours could walk blindly into disaster. It was not because the warnings were absent. It was because we had built an entire system that was very, very good at making warnings disappear. The second major incident happened almost 2 years after the Ilvath, far from the border, in a sector that had no strategic value at all except that it happened to sit near a shipping lane, used by both human and compact vessels. A Threll cargo hauler, a slow, heavily laden ship called the Marin Tide, was making its usual run when it drifted too close to what its logs later described as a human survey vessel conducting what appeared to be routine scientific work. There was no hostility recorded, no warning shots, no hailing frequencies used aggressively, nothing that suggested conflict was imminent. And then, according to the black box recovered from the wreckage, the Maritide's hull was breached in a single instant. A clean hole punched through its cargo section and out the other side, with enough force to send the ship into an uncontrolled spin that killed everyone aboard before rescue vessels could arrive. The official investigation blamed a micrometeorite strike. I want you to sit with that explanation for a moment, because when I first read it, I nearly laughed out loud, and not because it was funny. A micrometeorite large enough to punch clean through a reinforced cargo hull, on a trajectory that happened to align perfectly with a human survey vessel's position, at a moment when no such object had been detected by any sensor array in the region, either before or after the incident. It was not impossible in the strictest sense. Very few things are truly impossible. But it required believing in an extraordinary coincidence rather than the much simpler explanation sitting in plain sight, and our investigators chose the coincidence every single time, because the alternative meant admitting that a species we had dismissed as primitive possessed a weapon capable of casually destroying one of our ships without even appearing to try. I requested access to the full sensor logs from the Maritide investigation, and after considerable delay, I received a heavily redacted version that still contained enough raw data for me to run my own analysis. What I found confirmed everything I already suspected, and added a detail that chilled me even further. The trajectory of the strike, calculated from the entry and exit wounds in the hull, was consistent with an object traveling at a velocity so extreme that our own sensor arrays, which were calibrated to detect energy weapon discharges and standard kinetic threats like debris or conventional projectiles, simply were not fast enough to register it as a threat before impact. It was not that our sensors failed. It was that the weapon had been engineered, whether intentionally or as a natural consequence of its speed, to arrive faster than our detection systems could process. By the time any alarm could have sounded, the damage was already done. We were not just facing a weapon we did not understand. We were facing a weapon that moved faster than our ability to perceive danger at all. I began cataloging every incident I could find that matched this profile, and by the time I had finished, I had identified 11 separate events across a span of 5 years, all involving unexplained hull breaches near human territory, all dismissed through some combination of debris strikes, sensor malfunctions, or structural failures that, taken individually, might have seemed plausible, but which, taken together, painted a picture so clear that I genuinely could not understand how anyone reviewing the full dataset could fail to see it. I compiled everything into a single report, the most thorough piece of work I had ever produced, complete with trajectory models, timing analysis, and a direct comparison to historical accounts of primitive kinetic weapons scaled up to modern velocities. I submitted it through every official channel available to me, and for the first time, I received something other than silence. I received a meeting. I should have been encouraged. Instead, I walked into that meeting with a knot in my stomach, because I had learned by then that being taken seriously enough to warrant a meeting was not the same as being believed. The chamber was smaller than the one I remembered from years earlier, and the officers present were more senior, which I initially took as a positive sign. Among them was Fleet Admiral Sorrent Kane, a decorated officer whose career had been built on decisive victories against pirate fleets and rival trade consortiums decades earlier. He listened to my presentation with an expression of polite patience that I would come to recognize, far too late, as the particular kind of patience people extend to someone they have already decided is wrong. When I finished, Admiral Kane leaned back in his chair and asked me to explain, in simple terms, how a species with no shield technology, no beam weapons, and by all external appearances a military that lagged behind the compact by centuries, could possibly have developed a weapon capable of doing what I was describing. I told him the truth, which was that I believed humanity had chosen a different technological path entirely, one that prioritized velocity and mass over energy and defense, and that this path had produced a weapon so simple in concept that we had overlooked it precisely because it seemed too primitive to be dangerous. Admiral Kane smiled at that, not unkindly, and told me that in his 40 years of service, he had learned that primitive weapons remained primitive for a reason, and that the compact's shielding technology represented millennia of refinement, specifically designed to counter exactly the kind of threat I was describing. Kinetic weapons, he explained, as though I had not spent years studying the very history he was reciting to me, had been rendered obsolete the moment deflector technology reached maturity, because no solid projectile, however fast, could carry more raw destructive energy than a focused particle beam, and our shields were built to disperse precisely that kind of energy across their surface before it could cause structural damage. I tried to explain that the danger was not the energy of the projectile in the traditional sense, but its velocity and its complete lack of a detectable signature before impact, which meant our shields, however powerful, would have no time to respond, because our systems would not register the threat until it was already inside the ship. Admiral Kane's expression shifted slightly then, not toward concern, but toward something closer to condescension, and he told me that he appreciated my diligence, but that the compact could not reasonably reallocate defense resources and reshape military doctrine based on a theory built from circumstantial evidence and coincidental sensor readings. He thanked me for my report. He assured me it would be filed for future reference, and then the meeting ended, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that nothing I said that day, or any day before it, had made the slightest difference. What troubles me most, looking back, is not that I was dismissed. Analysts are dismissed all the time, and not every dismissed theory turns out to be correct. What troubles me is the reasoning behind the dismissal, because it revealed something rotten at the core of how the compact understood strength itself. We had confused sophistication with danger. We assumed that because our weapons were more complex, more elegant, requiring more advanced physics, and centuries of refinement to produce, they were automatically superior to anything simpler. We looked at a weapon built on a straightforward principle: accelerate a mass to an extreme velocity, and let physics do the rest, and we mistook its simplicity for weakness, when in truth, that same simplicity was exactly what made it so difficult to detect, and so impossible to properly defend against. Our shields were designed to counter energy. Humanity had simply stopped playing that game entirely, and built something our defenses were never designed to face. I began to notice the same pattern of thinking everywhere I looked, once I understood what I was looking for. It was not confined to military doctrine. It ran through diplomatic cartoons published in compact media, which depicted human ships as clumsy, oversized boxes next to sleek, compact vessels. It ran through casual conversation among colleagues, who referred to humans, when they referred to them at all, as the metal throwers, a term meant to be dismissive, a reminder that humanity's approach to warfare was seen as crude and unsophisticated compared to our own. It ran through official diplomatic correspondence, where compact representatives negotiated with human envoys using a tone of barely concealed condescension, treating every human request or protest as the understandable frustration of a junior species trying to assert itself among its betters. I attended one such negotiation session as a silent observer, watching a human diplomat named Grace Whitfield sit across the table from a compact trade minister, who spoke to her the way one might speak to a promising but naive student. She listened. She said very little. And there was something in the careful stillness of her expression that I did not understand at the time, but which I now believe was simply patience. The patience of someone who already knew how this story was going to end and was waiting for the rest of us to catch up. I met Grace Whitfield only once more after that, several months later, at a minor diplomatic function held to smooth over tensions following yet another unexplained incident involving a compact patrol vessel near human territory. I approached her, somewhat nervously, because I had read every transcript of her previous negotiations and had come to respect the careful precision of her language. I asked her directly, perhaps more directly than diplomatic protocol allowed, whether human vessels were equipped with kinetic weapons capable of piercing compact shielding. She looked at me for a long moment, and I remember thinking that her expression held no anger and no deception, only a kind of quiet, almost sad amusement, as though she were looking at someone who had asked a question whose answer would not matter until it was far too late to matter. She told me, in careful, measured words, that humanity had always believed in solving problems with the simplest tool available, and that sometimes the simplest tools were the ones people forgot to guard against. She did not confirm anything directly. She did not need to. I understood, walking away from that conversation, that I had just received the clearest warning of all, delivered not through sensor data or incident reports, but through the quiet honesty of someone who had nothing left to hide, because she knew we would not believe her, even if she told us everything outright. I wrote one final report after that conversation, shorter than the others, because I had run out of new evidence to present and had grown tired of repeating the same arguments to the same closed minds. I titled it simply, A Final Warning, and in it, I abandoned the careful, hedged language of professional analysis and wrote instead, with the blunt honesty of someone who no longer cared about protecting his career. I told my superiors that humanity possessed a weapon our doctrine had no answer for, that every incident we had dismissed as coincidence was, in fact, a demonstration, whether intentional or not, of a capability that could unravel our entire military strategy in a matter of moments, and that our refusal to investigate further was not caution, it was denial dressed up as prudence. I did not receive a response to that report. I did not expect one. By then, I understood that the compact was not going to change course because of anything I said. It was going to change course only when it had no other choice, and some quiet, dreadful part of me suspected that moment was not far away. Denial, I have come to understand, is not simply the act of ignoring evidence. It is far more sophisticated than that, and far more dangerous, because a civilization as advanced as the Corvan Trade Compact does not survive for 11,000 years by ignoring evidence outright. We were not stupid. We were something worse. We were skilled at explaining evidence away, and that skill, refined over millennia of comfortable dominance, became the very thing that blinded us when it mattered most. I spent the year following my final report studying this phenomenon almost as closely as I had studied the human weapon itself, because I needed to understand how an institution built on logic and evidence could so thoroughly fail to act on both. What I found was that the compact was not the only power making this mistake. It was a mistake shared by nearly every established species in the galaxy, and once I began comparing notes with contacts in other governments, quietly and unofficially, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I first spoke with a Sinai officer named Doran Kale, a naval strategist I had met years earlier at a joint security conference, who reached out to me through an encrypted channel after hearing rumors of my reports through professional circles that stretched across species lines. Doran told me a story that mirrored my own so closely it was almost eerie. A Sinai battle cruiser, patrolling near a contested border region, had been struck by what its crew described as an invisible weapon that tore through 3 layers of shielding before anyone on the bridge understood they were under attack. Doran had written his own report, using language remarkably similar to mine, proposing that humanity had developed kinetic weapons capable of bypassing conventional deflector technology. His report was rejected for reasons that could have been copied word for word from the rejection I received, citing insufficient evidence and an unlikely technological explanation, given humanity's otherwise unremarkable technological profile. I asked Doran why he thought his superiors had dismissed such clear evidence, and his answer stayed with me for a long time afterward. He told me that the Sinai military, like the Compact, had built its entire identity around a particular vision of what advanced warfare looked like, a vision centered on energy weapons and shielding technology so deeply embedded in their culture that any alternative approach felt not just wrong, but almost offensive to consider. Admitting that a supposedly primitive species had found a better answer would have meant admitting that centuries of Sinai military doctrine, taught in every academy, celebrated in every history text, was built on an assumption that had quietly stopped being true. No officer wanted to be the one to say that out loud, because doing so meant challenging not just a piece of technology, but an entire worldview. And worldviews, I learned, are far harder to dismantle than any weapon. I heard similar stories from a Threll logistics coordinator I contacted through a mutual colleague, and from a junior Vantis diplomat who had witnessed a border dispute escalate into an unexplained loss of a patrol vessel near human colonial space. Each story followed the same shape, a clear warning sign. A careful investigation that produced evidence pointing toward kinetic weaponry of extraordinary sophistication, a dismissal, gentle but absolute, rooted not in any actual counter-evidence, but in the simple, unshakable belief that humanity could not possibly have developed something the Compact and its allies had not. It was not a conspiracy. Nobody was hiding the truth on purpose. It was something far more mundane and far more dangerous, an entire civilization's collective inability to imagine that the story it told about itself might not be true anymore. I began to understand, during this period, that the denial was not evenly distributed. It was strongest among the people with the most to lose by admitting the truth, which meant it was strongest precisely among the officers and officials whose decisions mattered most. Junior analysts like myself, and like Doran Kale, people close enough to the raw data to see the patterns clearly, but far enough from real decision-making power to feel threatened by what the data implied, were often the first to sound the alarm. But the people who could actually act on that alarm, senior admirals, trade ministers, career diplomats who had built decades of professional identity around a particular understanding of galactic power, were the very people most incentivized to explain away anything that threatened that understanding. It was not that they lacked intelligence. It was that they had too much invested in being right about the way things had always been. There was a media culture that reinforced this denial at every level of compact society, and I want to describe it honestly, because it shaped how ordinary citizens across the compact thought about humanity long before any of us understood the danger we were actually facing. Entertainment programs depicted humans as bumbling, well-meaning but unsophisticated newcomers to galactic society, forever a step behind, forever needing guidance from wiser, more established species. Popular commentators built entire careers around gently mocking human customs, human technology, human ambitions, framing every human achievement as impressive for a species so young, rather than simply impressive on its own terms. I remember watching one such program with a colleague named Elena Marsh, a human liaison officer who had been assigned to our division as part of a cultural exchange initiative years before any of this began. She watched the program with an expression of careful neutrality, and when I asked her, somewhat awkwardly, what she thought of it, she told me that she found it interesting, the way a species could build such an elaborate and comfortable story about another species, without ever once asking whether that story was actually true. I did not understand the weight of her words at the time. I understand them now. Elena Marsh became, in a strange way, one of my most valuable sources during this period, though she never once revealed classified human information. What she offered instead was perspective, the quiet, patient perspective of someone who had watched an entire civilization build a caricature of her people, and mistake that caricature for reality. She told me once, over a meal in the station commissary, that human history was full of moments where one group underestimated another, because the underestimated group did not fit the expected picture of what strength was supposed to look like. She did not need to say anything more explicit than that. I understood, sitting across from her, that she was offering me the same warning everyone else had offered, wrapped in careful, deniable language, because she, like Grace Whitfield before her, seemed to already know that the warning would not be heeded until it was far too late to matter. I want to be fair to my own people, even now, even after everything that happened. The Compact's confidence was not built on nothing. We had fought and won wars against genuinely dangerous rivals over the centuries, powers with sophisticated energy weapons and shields comparable to our own, and we had prevailed more often than not because our technology, our tactics, and our resources were simply superior. That history was real, and it had earned the Compact a degree of confidence that was not, in itself, unreasonable. The mistake was not confidence. The mistake was allowing that confidence to calcify into an assumption that could not be questioned, an assumption so deeply embedded that actual evidence, presented clearly and repeatedly over the course of years, was not enough to shake it loose. I remember a conversation with my own division director, a Corvan administrator named Baron Ashcroft, who had reviewed my reports personally on more than one occasion and had always treated me with more patience than most of my other superiors. I asked him once, in a rare moment of candor between us, why he thought the Compact continued to dismiss evidence that seemed, to me, increasingly undeniable. Baron considered the question for a long moment before answering, and his answer was more honest than anything I had heard from anyone else in a position of authority. He told me that admitting humanity possessed a weapon capable of bypassing our shields would mean admitting that the entire defense budget, the entire military strategy, the entire diplomatic posture the Compact had built over the preceding decade was fundamentally wrong, and that kind of admission was not something any single officer wanted to be responsible for, because the political and professional cost of being the one who said it out loud was simply too high. It was easier, he said, and I could hear the discomfort in his own voice as he said it. For everyone to quietly agree that the evidence was inconclusive, because inconclusive evidence required no action, and no action meant no one had to be blamed when nothing bad happened. The problem, of course, was that something bad was eventually going to happen, and when it did, the very inaction that had felt so safe would suddenly look like the greatest failure in compact military history. I left that conversation with a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because for the first time, someone in a position of real authority had admitted, at least privately, that the danger was real. Dread, because Baron's honesty changed nothing about the compact's official policy, and I understood that admitting a truth privately, in a quiet conversation between two people, was a very different thing from acting on that truth in front of an entire fleet command structure, built to resist exactly this kind of unwelcome revelation. The final piece of denial I want to describe, before I move on to what happened next, is perhaps the most human failing of all, if you will forgive me for using that particular word to describe a distinctly Corvan mistake. It was the belief that time was on our side. Even among officials who privately acknowledged that humanity might possess dangerous kinetic technology, there remained a widespread assumption that we had time to study the problem, time to develop countermeasures, time to gather more conclusive evidence before committing to any major policy shift. Nobody believed the danger was imminent. Nobody believed that a full confrontation was close at hand. We had convinced ourselves that whatever humanity possessed, it existed within a slow, manageable timeline that matched the leisurely pace at which the compact was accustomed to addressing its problems. We did not understand, because we had no way of understanding, that humanity did not share our sense of time, that every incident we had dismissed as an isolated anomaly was in fact part of a pattern humanity had been quietly observing and refining for years, and that the patience we mistook for weakness or inaction on their part was, in truth, the calm, deliberate patience of a species that already knew exactly how capable it was, and was simply waiting to see how long it would take us to figure that out for ourselves. We would find out, sooner than any of us expected, and the answer would arrive not as another quiet report filed and forgotten, but as an entire fleet learning, in the span of a few catastrophic minutes, everything I had been trying to tell them for 6 long years. The decision to send a fleet toward human space did not come from any single dramatic event. It came, instead, from a slow accumulation of frustration among compact leadership, a growing sense among the Admiralty that human colonial expansion had grown too bold, too fast, and needed to be reminded, firmly but diplomatically, exactly where the true balance of power in the galaxy resided. I learned about the mission almost by accident, catching a fragment of conversation in a hallway between 2 senior officers discussing fleet deployment schedules, and when I confirmed the rumor through official channels, I felt something in my chest tighten that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with dread. The mission was officially described as a demonstration of resolve, a phrase that sounded reasonable enough in a briefing document but meant, in practice, sending a significant portion of the compact's border fleet directly into a region where humanity had recently established a new colony, close enough to previously disputed territory that tensions had been simmering for months. The stated goal was to project strength, to remind human colonial administrators that further expansion without proper coordination with compact trade authorities would not be tolerated indefinitely. Admiral Sorrent Kane, the same officer who had dismissed my report in that meeting years earlier, was given command of the operation, a decision that struck me as bitterly appropriate given everything that had happened since. I requested a position as an official observer aboard the flagship, a request that surprised several of my colleagues given how thoroughly my career had stalled since my early reports on human weaponry. I think, looking back, that my superiors approved the request partly out of a strange sense of professional courtesy, a way of allowing the analyst who had been so wrong, in their estimation, to finally see for himself just how wrong he truly was. I did not correct their assumptions. I simply accepted the assignment and told myself that whatever happened, I needed to see it with my own eyes, because 6 years of being dismissed had left me with a desperate need to know, one way or another, whether I had been right. The flagship Voranth was, by any reasonable measure, an impressive vessel. It stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, bristling with plasma cannon arrays and layered deflector shielding capable of absorbing sustained fire from an entire enemy battle group. It carried a crew complement of just over 4,000, supported by an escort of 12 additional warships, ranging from swift interceptor-class vessels to heavy cruisers, nearly as well armed as the flagship itself. Standing on the observation deck as we departed compact space, watching the fleet arrange itself into formation against the backdrop of open stars, I understood, on some purely visceral level, why my superiors found it so difficult to imagine any single human vessel posing a serious threat to a force this size. It looked unstoppable. It felt unstoppable. And that feeling, I now understand, was exactly the trap that had been laid for us, not by any deliberate human deception, but by our own inability to separate the appearance of strength from the reality of it. The journey toward the disputed colonial region took several days, and I spent much of that time reviewing every piece of data I had ever gathered on human kinetic weaponry, hoping against hope that I had somehow miscalculated, that the fleet I was traveling with truly was as invulnerable as its size and armament suggested. I spoke, during this time, with several officers aboard the Voranth, most of whom treated my presence with polite indifference, though a few, aware of my history, seemed to take a certain quiet pleasure in reminding me how thoroughly the mission's success was expected to vindicate the Compact's confidence in its own superiority. One tactical officer, a sharp, efficient woman named Corinne Aldrich, engaged me in a lengthy conversation over a shared meal, during which she outlined, in impressive detail, the layered defensive protocols the fleet would employ if any hostile contact occurred. Multiple redundant shield harmonics, point defense systems capable of intercepting incoming projectiles at extreme range, rapid response fighter wings ready to launch within moments of any detected threat. It was, on paper, an extraordinarily thorough defense, built by people who understood their own technology intimately and had every reason to trust it, based on centuries of accumulated experience fighting other advanced powers. I did not argue with Corinne. I had learned, after 6 years of failed arguments, that presenting evidence to people who had already decided what they believed accomplished nothing except making me look increasingly desperate. Instead, I asked her a single question, the same question I had been unable to answer satisfactorily for years. I asked her what would happen if an incoming threat arrived faster than the fleet's sensors could detect it, faster than any point defense system could calculate an intercept solution, faster than the shield harmonics she had described could adjust to counter an unfamiliar attack profile. Corinne considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness, to her credit, before answering that such a scenario was, as far as compact physics understood it, essentially impossible, because any object with sufficient mass and velocity to bypass our defenses, that thoroughly would require an amount of energy to accelerate that no known propulsion or weapon system could realistically generate, without producing an enormous, easily detectable energy signature, well before the weapon was ever fired. It was a reasonable answer, grounded in real physics, and it was also, I now know, precisely and catastrophically wrong, because it assumed that human engineering was bound by the same practical limitations and design philosophy that shaped compact technology, when in fact, humanity had simply approached the entire problem from a direction none of us had considered seriously enough. We arrived at the edge of the disputed region on the 6th day of the journey, and Admiral Kane ordered the fleet into a standard approach formation, a wide, layered arrangement designed to project maximum visible strength while maintaining tactical flexibility if negotiations turned hostile. I stood on the observation deck alongside several other officers, watching the sensor displays as the fleet closed the distance toward the human colony, and I remember feeling a strange, hollow calm settle over me, the particular stillness that comes when you have spent years dreading a moment and finally find yourself standing inside it. The human response, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity, and that simplicity should have terrified everyone aboard the Voranth far more than it did. Rather than mobilizing a defense fleet of comparable size, as our tactical planners had fully expected, Human Colonial Command dispatched a single vessel to meet us at the negotiated contact point, a ship that our sensors classified, almost dismissively, as a mid-sized patrol cruiser, far smaller and less heavily armed, at least according to our scanning data, than any single ship in our own formation. I watched several officers exchange amused glances as the ship's profile appeared on the tactical display, and I heard Admiral Kane himself remark, with a note of satisfaction in his voice, that this was precisely the kind of restrained, appropriately cautious response he had expected from a colonial administration that understood, even if it would not openly admit it, exactly how outmatched it truly was. The human ship was named, according to the identification signal it transmitted upon our approach, the Meridian Watch, commanded by a captain, identified only as Daniel Voss. There was no accompanying fleet, no visible support vessels lurking at the edges of our sensor range, nothing to suggest this was anything other than a single, isolated ship sent to represent human interests in what everyone aboard the Voranth assumed would be a brief, one-sided negotiation, followed, if necessary, by an equally brief and one-sided demonstration of force. I remember standing at the observation window, watching that single small ship hold its position against the overwhelming mass of our formation, and feeling, for the first time in years, a genuine flicker of doubt about my own theories, because surely, I told myself, no rational commander would send a single ship to face an entire battle fleet, unless that commander was either extraordinarily foolish or extraordinarily confident, and foolishness did not match anything I had learned about human military behavior over the preceding 6 years. Admiral Kane opened a communication channel, and the exchange that followed was recorded and later studied extensively, though at the time it felt almost routine, a formal but firm statement of compact concerns regarding unauthorized colonial expansion, delivered with the practiced diplomatic courtesy of an officer who fully expected his demands to be received with appropriate deference. Captain Voss responded with a calm, measured voice that carried none of the anxiety or defensiveness I might have expected from someone facing down a force many times the size of his own vessel. He acknowledged the compact's concerns. He stated, without elaboration, that human colonial administrators would review the boundary dispute through proper diplomatic channels. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added a single line that I did not fully understand the significance of until much later, telling Admiral Kane that he hoped this exchange could remain a diplomatic matter, because neither side, in his words, would benefit from it becoming anything else. I remember the silence that followed that statement, the way several officers on the bridge exchanged glances that mixed amusement with faint irritation, interpreting the captain's words as a thinly veiled threat from a commander who had no real capacity to back it up. Admiral Kane responded with a tone of measured condescension, assuring Captain Voss that the compact had no desire for conflict, provided human colonial authorities demonstrated appropriate respect for established trade boundaries going forward. The exchange ended shortly after, both ships holding position at a respectful distance, and for a brief window of time, perhaps 20 minutes, it seemed as though the entire mission might conclude exactly as everyone aboard the Voranth had expected, with a firm diplomatic message delivered and received, no shots fired, no need for the elaborate defensive protocols Corinne Aldrich had described to me so confidently days earlier. I do not know, even now, exactly what triggered the moment that followed. Official compact records, prepared long after the fact by officials eager to assign blame anywhere except their own decision-making, suggested that a secondary compact patrol vessel, operating independently near the edge of the negotiated contact zone, misread its sensor data and interpreted routine human fleet movement deeper in the system as a hostile buildup, prompting an automated defensive response that the patrol vessel's crew failed to countermand quickly enough. I have my doubts about how much of that explanation is accurate, and how much is simply the least embarrassing version of events that compact leadership could construct afterward. What I know for certain, because I was standing on the observation deck of the Voranth when it happened, is that alarms began sounding across multiple ships in our formation within the same handful of seconds, and that whatever the cause, whatever the intention on either side, the fragile, temporary calm of that negotiation shattered almost instantly, and the fleet I had traveled with for 6 days found itself, with no clear warning and no real chance to reconsider, standing at the edge of a confrontation that 6 years of ignored warnings had done absolutely nothing to prepare it for. I want to describe what happened next as precisely as I can, because I have replayed those minutes in my mind so many times since that day that I sometimes worry the memory has become sharper than reality, polished smooth by repetition, until it feels less like something that happened to me and more like a story I am telling about someone else. But I was there. I felt the deck shudder beneath my feet. I heard the sound 4,000 crew members made in the instant they understood their ship was no longer safe. I will try to give you the truth of it, as close as memory allows. The alarms that began sounding across the fleet were, at first, nothing more than standard proximity alerts, the kind of automated warning any modern warship generates constantly during a tense standoff, flagging minor course corrections and sensor fluctuations that rarely mean anything at all. I remember Admiral Kane's voice, calm and irritated in equal measure, ordering his tactical officers to identify the source of the disturbance, clearly expecting the answer to be some minor miscalculation, easily corrected, before it escalated into anything serious. That expectation lasted perhaps 10 seconds. The first strike hit one of our escort cruisers, a vessel called the Ardent Spire, positioned roughly 2 kilometers off our port side. I was looking directly at the tactical display when it happened, and what I saw, or rather what I failed to see, is the detail that has stayed with me most vividly. There was no buildup, no energy spike on any sensor readout, no warning icon, no targeting alert, nothing that any officer aboard the Voranth could have reacted to, even if they had been staring directly at the exact right section of the display, at the exact right moment. One instant, the Ardent Spire's status indicator showed full shields and standard operational readiness. In the very next instant, so close together that the display seemed almost to glitch rather than update normally, the same indicator flashed a catastrophic hull breach warning, followed within seconds by a secondary explosion that ruptured the ship's reactor containment and turned what had been a fully crewed cruiser into an expanding cloud of debris and superheated gas. I remember the sound that filled the bridge in that moment. Not screaming exactly, but something close to it. A collective, involuntary intake of breath from dozens of officers who had spent their entire careers believing that a ship's death was supposed to look like a battle, supposed to unfold with visible weapons fire and dramatic exchanges of energy blasts. Not this. Not silence followed instantly by annihilation with no discernible cause. Corinne Aldrich, the tactical officer who had explained the fleet's layered defensive protocols to me so confidently just days earlier, stood frozen at her station for a full 2 seconds before her training reasserted itself and she began frantically cross-referencing sensor logs, trying to identify what weapon system could possibly have produced that result. I already knew the answer. I had known it, in some form, for 6 years, knowing it did nothing to prepare me for watching it happen. The second strike came less than 15 seconds after the first, this time hitting a heavy cruiser called the Dornick Ascent, positioned near the rear of our formation, and the pattern repeated itself with a precision that felt almost mechanical in its cruelty. No warning, no detectable energy signature, a status readout showing full operational capacity one instant, and catastrophic structural failure the next, so close together in time that the human mind struggles to process them as separate events, rather than a single continuous horror. I heard Admiral Kane's voice again, no longer calm, demanding to know the source of the attack, demanding that someone, anyone, identify the weapon responsible before it could strike a third time. Nobody could answer him, because nobody's sensors had registered anything to identify. We were being struck by something that arrived and departed faster than our instruments could properly observe it, a weapon that existed, from our perspective, only in the instant of impact and the devastation that followed. I need to explain something about human railgun technology here, not because I want to interrupt the horror of that moment with technical explanation, but because understanding it is the only way to understand why an entire fleet of advanced warships, equipped with shielding capable of withstanding sustained energy weapon barrages, found itself utterly helpless against a single ship. A railgun, in its most basic principle, uses powerful electromagnetic force to accelerate a solid metal projectile along a set of rails, converting electrical energy directly into kinetic velocity, without any chemical propellant or energy discharge that a sensor array would typically be calibrated to detect. Humanity had spent decades refining this technology, to a point where their projectiles traveled at velocities approaching a significant fraction of the speed of light, meaning that by the time any conventional sensor system detected the projectile at all, it had often already covered the entire distance to its target and delivered its impact. Our shields, built over centuries specifically to disperse and absorb focused energy discharges like plasma bolts and particle beams, had no meaningful answer for an attack that carried almost no energy signature during transit, and delivered its destructive force purely through the transfer of kinetic momentum upon impact, force so extreme that it simply did not matter how many layers of deflector shielding a ship carried, because the shields were designed to stop the wrong kind of threat entirely. The third and fourth strikes came almost simultaneously, tearing through 2 more vessels in our formation, within the span of a single breath, and it was at this point that the true horror of the situation became clear to everyone aboard the Voranth, myself included, though I had understood the theoretical danger for years, without ever truly comprehending what it would feel like in practice. This was not a battle in any sense the compact military understood battles. There was no exchange of fire, no tactical maneuvering, no opportunity for our vastly superior numbers or our sophisticated defensive systems to matter at all, because the entire engagement was happening on a timescale that made every advantage we possessed completely irrelevant. Our fleet had been built and trained to fight wars where both sides could see each other's weapons fire coming, where shields had time to adjust, where point defense systems could calculate intercept trajectories against incoming threats moving at speeds our sensors were designed to track. None of that mattered against a weapon that arrived faster than the concept of warning had any meaning. I watched Admiral Kane, a man who had spent 40 years building a reputation as one of the Compact's most capable naval officers, stand at the center of his own bridge, issuing orders that had no chance of mattering, because there was no evasive maneuver fast enough to avoid a threat that could not be seen coming, no point defense response quick enough to intercept a projectile that had already struck before its existence could even be confirmed. I saw the exact moment his confidence broke, not through any dramatic outburst, but through a small, almost imperceptible change in his posture, a slight slump in his shoulders, as the tactical display continued updating with new losses, each one confirming, with brutal finality, everything I had spent 6 years trying to warn him, and everyone like him, would happen exactly like this. The Voranth itself was struck on what I believe was the 6th or 7th impact of the engagement, though by that point the strikes were coming close enough together that maintaining an exact count felt almost beside the point. I felt the deck lurch violently beneath me, heard a groan of tortured metal somewhere deep within the ship's structure, and watched emergency lighting flicker across the observation deck as damage control alerts began flooding every available display. The strike had hit somewhere near the ship's midsection, far enough from my position that I survived the initial impact, though I would learn later that it had torn through 11 decks and killed over 300 crew members in the span of less than a second, a number that still, even now, feels impossible to hold fully in my mind. I remember standing there, gripping a support railing to keep myself upright, as the ship shuddered around me, watching officers who had laughed at my reports years earlier now scrambling to understand a threat none of them had prepared for, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Not vindication, though I understand why someone might expect that. What I felt instead was a deep, hollow grief, because being right about this particular danger meant watching thousands of people I had spent years trying to warn suffer the exact consequences I had predicted, and there is no satisfaction in that, none at all, only the terrible weight of knowing that every warning I had written, every report that had been dismissed, every meeting where I had been politely and thoroughly ignored, had been a chance to prevent exactly this moment, a chance that my own civilization's stubborn pride had thrown away, one dismissal at a time, until there was nothing left to do but stand on a dying ship and watch the nightmare I had spent 6 years describing finally, unmistakably, arrive. The engagement, if it can even be called that, lasted a little under 4 minutes from the first strike to the moment Admiral Kane's voice, hoarse and stripped of every trace of its earlier confidence, transmitted an open request for ceasefire across every channel our communications array could reach. 4 minutes. I have spent considerable time since that day trying to understand how a confrontation of such enormous consequence, one that would reshape the Compact's entire military doctrine and its understanding of its place in the galaxy, could unfold in a span of time shorter than it takes to eat a simple meal. The answer, I have come to accept, is that catastrophe rarely announces itself with the dramatic pacing our stories and histories had led us to expect. It simply happens, faster than the mind can properly process, and the reckoning comes only afterward, in the long, quiet hours of counting losses and trying to understand what went wrong. By the time the Meridian Watch ceased fire, 7 vessels from our formation had been destroyed outright, including the Ardent Spire and the Dornic Ascent, and 4 more, including the Voranth itself, had sustained damage severe enough to leave them barely capable of independent movement. The human losses, by contrast, were non-existent. Captain Voss's single vessel had not sustained so much as a scratch across its hull throughout the entire engagement, a fact that felt almost too cruel to process alongside everything else, though I understood, even in the chaos of those first hours, exactly why it was true. Our fleet had never been able to detect the incoming projectiles well enough to fire back with any accuracy, and the few desperate return shots our own weapons crews managed to launch, blind, panicked attempts to strike back at a threat they could not properly locate, had missed entirely, sailing harmlessly past a ship that had simply positioned itself with a precision that suggested Captain Voss had understood, long before the engagement began, exactly how this confrontation was going to unfold. I want to describe the aftermath aboard the Voranth honestly, because it revealed something about my own people that I had not fully appreciated until I watched it happen. In the immediate hours following the ceasefire, as damage control teams worked desperately to stabilize the ship, and medical staff struggled to treat the wounded and account for the dead, I watched officers who had spent years dismissing every warning about human weaponry move through the wreckage of their own certainty, with a kind of stunned, disoriented grief that went far beyond simple military defeat. This was not merely a battle lost. This was the collapse of an entire framework for understanding the galaxy, and I do not think any of them, myself included, despite everything I had predicted, was truly prepared for what it felt like to watch that framework fail in real time. Corinne Aldrich found me several hours later, in a corridor near the ship's damaged medical bay, where I had been helping carry wounded crew members to overflow treatment areas, because there was simply nothing else useful I could do with my hands, while I waited to learn whether the ship itself would survive. She looked at me for a long moment, her uniform stained with the residue of the ship's atmosphere scrubbers working overtime to clear smoke from ruptured conduits, and she asked me, in a voice stripped of the confident professionalism I remembered from our conversation days earlier, how long I had known. I told her the truth, that I had suspected for 6 years and had been certain for at least 3, and that I had tried, repeatedly, and through every official channel available to me, to make that certainty known to the people who might have been able to act on it. She did not respond with anger, which surprised me. She simply nodded, slowly, and told me that she understood now, far better than she wanted to, exactly why I had asked her that question about undetectable threats during our meal together, and that she wished, more than she could properly express, that she had taken the question as seriously then as she was forced to take it now. Admiral Kane summoned me to a private meeting less than a day after the engagement, once the immediate crisis of damage control had stabilized enough for him to turn his attention to understanding what had actually happened. I do not think I have ever walked into a room with more complicated feelings than I carried into that meeting, because some part of me, a part I am not entirely proud of, wanted him to apologize, wanted some acknowledgement of everything he had dismissed, while another, larger part of me, understood that an apology, even a sincere one, would do absolutely nothing to bring back the crew members we had lost, and that dwelling on vindication was a luxury none of us could afford anymore. Kane did not apologize, not exactly, though what he offered instead felt, in its own way, more honest than an apology might have been. He asked me to walk him through everything I had documented over the preceding 6 years, not as a formality, but with the focused, desperate attention of a man trying to compress years of ignored analysis into whatever time remained before the compact had to formulate some kind of response to what had just happened. I spent nearly 3 hours in that room, laying out every incident, every trajectory calculation, every piece of evidence I had gathered about human kinetic weaponry, and for the first time in 6 years, someone with the authority to act on that information was listening not with polite condescension, but with the focused urgency of a man who finally understood exactly how much his earlier dismissal had cost. What struck me most during that meeting was not Kane's belated attention to my analysis, but the specific nature of the questions he asked, because they revealed just how fundamentally the compact's entire strategic framework would need to change to account for a threat like this. He asked whether our shielding technology could be redesigned to counter kinetic impacts rather than energy discharges, and I had to explain that shield harmonics calibrated for kinetic dispersal existed in theory, but had never been seriously developed, because no threat in living memory had required them. He asked whether our sensor arrays could be upgraded to detect railgun projectiles before impact, and I explained that doing so would require a fundamental redesign of detection technology built around anticipating threats that moved faster than light-based sensors could easily track, a problem that our best engineers had not even begun to seriously study, because nobody had believed the problem was real. Every question Kane asked led to the same uncomfortable answer, that the compact possessed the theoretical scientific knowledge to eventually counter this threat, but that doing so would require years, possibly decades, of dedicated research and development, time we no longer had the luxury of assuming we possessed, because humanity had already demonstrated, in a single 4-minute engagement, exactly how far ahead of us they had already moved. I raised, carefully, the question that had haunted me since the moment the engagement ended, which was why Captain Voss and the human colonial administration had chosen to demonstrate this capability at all, rather than continuing to hide it as they apparently had, for years, through a long string of unexplained incidents that the compact had consistently dismissed as coincidence. Kane did not have an answer, and neither did I, not with any certainty, though I offered him my best theory, one that had been forming slowly over the preceding hours, as I processed everything that had happened. I suggested that humanity had never intended for this engagement to escalate into open conflict, that the confusion which triggered the first strike had likely come from our own side, exactly as the preliminary report suggested, and that once the confrontation began, Captain Voss had made a calculated decision to demonstrate overwhelming capability decisively and immediately, not to provoke further conflict, but specifically to prevent it, understanding correctly that a fleet which believed itself safely superior would only escalate further unless shown, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how mistaken that belief truly was. It was, if my theory was correct, an act of brutal, pragmatic mercy, a demonstration painful enough to end the conflict in minutes rather than allow it to drag into a prolonged war that would have cost far more lives on both sides before the same lesson was eventually learned. Kane listened to this theory in silence, and when I finished, he asked me one final question, quieter than everything that had come before it: whether I believed humanity had shown us the full extent of what they were capable of, or whether what we had witnessed represented only a fraction of their actual capability, held back deliberately to avoid revealing more than was strategically necessary. I did not have a confident answer to that question then, and I am not certain I have one now, though everything I have learned in the time since that engagement has led me to suspect the truth is closer to the second possibility than the first, and that suspicion, more than anything else that happened during those 4 terrible minutes, is what keeps me awake most nights even now. The months that followed the engagement changed my life in ways I could never have predicted during those long years of being dismissed and quietly sidelined. I was recalled to Corvan Prime not as a disgraced analyst whose theories had finally, tragically, been proven correct, but as one of the very few people in the entire compact who had spent years studying human kinetic weaponry with anything approaching real rigor. The same institutions that had rejected my reports, transferred me to lesser postings, and treated my persistence as a professional liability now needed everything I knew, and they needed it faster than I could comfortably provide it, because the political fallout from the engagement had created a demand for answers that could no longer be satisfied with polite dismissal. I want to be honest about how strange this reversal felt, because I do not think anyone who has not lived through something similar can fully appreciate the particular disorientation of watching an institution that spent years telling you that you were wrong, suddenly, urgently, need you to be right. I was given an expanded research division, more resources than I had ever imagined having access to during my earlier career, and a mandate to lead the Compact's first serious research initiative into countering human kinetic weaponry. I should have felt vindicated. In many ways I did. But vindication arrived wrapped in grief, because every resource I was now given, every research team assigned to my division, every urgent meeting scheduled to hear my analysis, existed only because thousands of people had died to prove a point I had been making for 6 years, using nothing but data and careful reasoning, and no amount of belated recognition could undo that loss. The Compact's response to the engagement unfolded across several fronts simultaneously, and I found myself, almost by necessity, at the center of nearly all of them, coordinating between military research divisions, diplomatic teams attempting damage control with human colonial authorities, and a public information office desperately trying to manage a compact population that was, for the first time in living memory, genuinely afraid of a species it had spent years mocking. Public sentiment shifted with a speed that surprised even me, moving almost overnight from casual condescension toward something closer to anxious fascination, as ordinary citizens across compact space began asking, loudly and insistently, exactly the same questions I had been asking privately for years. How had this happened? Why had nobody warned us? What else did we not know about the species we had so confidently dismissed as primitive? I testified, over the following weeks, before an emergency session of the Compact Joint Security Council, an experience that felt almost surreal, given how thoroughly similar bodies had ignored me in the past. I stood in a chamber far larger and more formally arranged than any I had presented in before, facing representatives not just from the Corvan leadership, but from the Threll, the Sinai, and the Vantis governments as well, all of whom had, I now understood, received their own quiet warnings over the preceding years, and dismissed them just as thoroughly as my own superiors had dismissed mine. I laid out everything I knew, not as a desperate analyst trying to convince skeptical superiors of a threat they refused to see, but as the closest thing the Compact now possessed to an authority on human military capability, a role I had never wanted and would have traded away instantly if it meant undoing everything that had happened to earn it. During that testimony, I met Doran Kale in person for the first time, the Sinai officer whose earlier report had mirrored my own so closely, and whose career had suffered nearly identical consequences for reasons that, in hindsight, felt painfully predictable. We spoke at length during the recesses between formal sessions, comparing notes not just on the technical details of human weaponry, but on the strange, isolating experience of watching an entire civilization refuse to believe something that felt, to us, undeniably obvious. Doran told me something during one of these conversations that I have carried with me ever since, that the greatest danger any advanced civilization faces is not a lack of intelligence or a lack of resources, but a lack of humility, an inability to imagine that the story it tells about its own supremacy might simply be wrong, and that this failure of imagination, far more than any weapon humanity possessed, was the true reason the engagement had unfolded exactly as catastrophically as it did. The research into countering human kinetic weaponry proceeded with an urgency that stood in stark contrast to the years of institutional indifference that had preceded it, though I quickly learned that urgency alone could not compress years of necessary scientific development into months. My teams made real progress in certain areas, developing early prototype sensor arrays calibrated to detect the specific electromagnetic signature produced during a railgun's firing sequence, giving our ships, at best, a few additional seconds of warning before impact, seconds that would not have saved the Ardent Spire or the Dornic Ascent, but which might, in future engagements, provide just enough time for evasive maneuvers to reduce a direct hit into a glancing one. We began experimenting with layered kinetic dispersal shielding, an entirely new category of defensive technology, built specifically to address a threat our engineers had never seriously considered before, though early prototypes remained far less reliable than the energy shielding the Compact had relied on for centuries, a humbling reminder of exactly how much ground we had to cover. What troubled me most throughout this research, and what I made certain to communicate honestly to every official who would listen, was the growing realization that even our most successful countermeasures were likely to remain, for years to come, defensive improvements rather than true solutions. We could detect a railgun firing sequence a few seconds sooner. We could disperse a fraction of a kinetic impact's force across a redesigned shield harmonic. We could not, with any technology available to us in the foreseeable future, match the fundamental advantage humanity had built for itself, a weapon platform so simple in principle and so thoroughly refined in practice that it had rendered centuries of compact military doctrine functionally obsolete in the span of 4 catastrophic minutes. Closing that gap would require not just new technology, but an entirely new way of thinking about warfare, and I understood, better than almost anyone in the Compact, exactly how difficult that kind of fundamental rethinking had proven to be, because I had spent 6 years trying and failing to convince my own people to even begin that process before it was too late. I met with Elena Marsh one final time during this period, in a quiet meeting arranged through diplomatic back channels rather than official military communication, and our conversation felt very different from the careful, guarded exchanges we had shared in earlier years. She no longer needed to speak in careful, deniable hints, because the truth was no longer something either of us needed to protect. I asked her, directly, whether humanity intended further conflict with the Compact, and she told me, with the same quiet honesty I remembered from our earlier conversations, that human colonial leadership had never wanted this confrontation, that the demonstration of force at the engagement had been intended specifically to prevent a much larger and more costly war rather than to provoke one, and that human diplomatic representatives were prepared to work toward a stable, respectful relationship with the Compact, provided that relationship was built on an honest understanding of capability rather than the comfortable fiction the Compact had maintained for so many years. I believed her, and I still believe her today, though I understand that belief alone cannot guarantee the kind of lasting peace both our peoples now need. What I learned, through months of research, testimony, and quiet conversation in the aftermath of that engagement, was that the greatest lesson of this entire story was never really about railguns, or shields, or any specific piece of military technology at all. It was about the danger of assuming that strength always looks like the strength you already understand, and the catastrophic cost of dismissing a warning simply because it does not fit the comfortable story you have told yourself for centuries. The Compact learned that lesson in the worst possible way, through loss that could have been prevented if even a fraction of the warnings raised over those 6 years had been taken seriously. I hope, more than I can properly express, that whatever powers rise to challenge humanity, or the Compact in the centuries ahead, will learn that same lesson through study and humility, rather than through the kind of devastating proof that finally, undeniably taught it to us. A year has passed since the engagement, and I find myself, more often than I would like, standing at the observation window of my new research facility on Corvan Prime, looking out at the stars and thinking about how differently everything might have unfolded if my first report had simply been taken seriously all those years ago. I do not say this out of bitterness, though I would be lying if I claimed bitterness played no part in how I process those memories. I say it because understanding exactly how we failed, and why we failed, remains the single most important task facing the Compact today, more important even than the technical research my division continues to pursue, because technology alone cannot fix a civilization that has not learned to question its own assumptions. The galaxy has changed in ways that would have seemed unthinkable to me during those early years of ignored warnings. Every major power that once treated humanity with casual condescension has quietly begun the same painful process the Compact undertook after the engagement, re-examining old incidents, funding new research divisions, and, in more than a few cases I have heard about through professional contacts across species lines, promoting analysts who had once been dismissed for raising exactly the concerns that later proved devastatingly accurate. Doran Kale now leads a similar research initiative for the Sinai government, and we correspond regularly, comparing notes and sharing what limited progress our respective teams have made toward developing genuine countermeasures, rather than the modest defensive improvements we have managed so far. I want to be honest about where that progress actually stands, because I think false comfort would dishonor everyone who died learning the lesson the hard way. Our sensor improvements can now detect a railgun firing sequence with enough advance warning to attempt evasive action, though success rates in simulated engagements remain far lower than any military strategist would consider acceptable. Our kinetic dispersal shielding has improved considerably since those early prototypes, though it still falls well short of the near-total protection our energy shields once provided against conventional weapons. We have made real progress. We have not closed the gap, and I do not believe, honestly, that we will close it within my lifetime, because humanity has not stood still while we studied the lessons of a single engagement. Every indication we have gathered through careful, respectful diplomatic channels suggests that human weapons technology continues advancing at a pace that our own research divisions struggle simply to track, let alone match. This is, I think, the deepest and most uncomfortable truth to emerge from everything that happened, and it is a truth I have tried to communicate carefully to every official and every audience willing to listen in the year since the engagement. Humanity's advantage was never really about railguns specifically, however central that particular weapon was to the events I have described. Their true advantage lay in a way of approaching problems that our own civilization, comfortable and confident after millennia of uncontested dominance, had simply lost the capacity to replicate. They looked at old, familiar ideas and asked what those ideas could become if pursued with total commitment, rather than assuming that familiarity meant obsolescence. They watched a rival civilization dismiss every warning sign for years and used that patient observation to understand us far better than we ever bothered to understand them. They demonstrated overwhelming capability not to conquer or destroy, but specifically calibrated to end a conflict as quickly and as survivably as possible for everyone involved, a level of strategic restraint that I suspect our own military doctrine, even now, would struggle to match if our positions were somehow reversed. I think often about Captain Daniel Voss, the officer whose single ship demonstrated more genuine strategic sophistication in 4 minutes than our entire fleet command structure had managed to develop in years of preparation. I have never met him personally, and given the current state of diplomatic relations between our peoples, I suspect I may never have the opportunity. But I think about the calm, measured tone of his voice during that final communication before the engagement began. The way he expressed hope that the confrontation could remain a diplomatic matter, not as an empty gesture, but as a genuine warning delivered by someone who understood exactly what was coming and sincerely wished it could be avoided. I wonder sometimes whether things might have unfolded differently if Admiral Kane had heard something more than condescension in those words. If even one officer aboard that bridge had paused, in that critical moment, to ask themselves what kind of commander speaks with such quiet confidence while facing an entire hostile fleet, and what that confidence might actually mean. I have also come to think differently about Grace Whitfield and Elena Marsh, the 2 human diplomats whose careful, patient honesty offered warnings I was too slow to fully understand until it was almost too late. I understand now that they were never trying to deceive the compact, nor were they bound by any official policy of secrecy that prevented them from being more direct. They simply understood, with a clarity that our own institutions lacked, that some truths cannot be given to people who have already decided, deep in their institutional bones, that those truths cannot possibly be real. They offered honesty, in the only form that had any chance of eventually being heard, patient, careful, and respectful of a listener's dignity, even when that listener was walking, step by step, toward a catastrophe that honesty alone could not prevent. The most important change I have witnessed over this past year is not technological, though the research my division conducts remains vital and will continue for as long as the compact requires it. The most important change is cultural, slow and uneven, and far from complete, but real nonetheless. Young analysts entering compact intelligence services today are trained, for the first time in the institution's long history, to actively question inherited assumptions about what advanced warfare must look like, to treat unexplained incidents with the same seriousness regardless of how uncomfortably they fit existing doctrine, and to understand that dismissing a threat because it seems too simple to be dangerous is itself one of the most dangerous mistakes a civilization can make. I lecture these young analysts regularly now, and I make certain to tell them, every single time, the story of the Ilvath and the Marin Tide, and every quiet warning that was buried under bureaucratic caution until the warnings finally, catastrophically, proved themselves true in a way no one could dismiss any longer. I do not know what the future holds for the relationship between the compact and humanity, and I have learned, through hard experience, to be deeply suspicious of anyone, myself included, who claims to know these things with confidence. What I do know is that the galaxy is larger and stranger, and far less predictable than the comfortable story the compact told itself for 11,000 years, and that humanity's arrival taught us this lesson in the most painful way imaginable, through loss that honest curiosity and genuine humility could have prevented years before the first railgun ever fired. I think about this every time I walk past the memorial wall recently constructed near the compact fleet headquarters, listing the names of everyone lost during the engagement, a wall I helped advocate for specifically because I believed, and still believe, that remembering the true cost of denial matters as much as developing better shields or faster sensors. There is a phrase that has followed me since that day, one that officers across the compact still repeat, sometimes with grim humor, sometimes with genuine, lingering dread. Whenever a new unexplained incident crosses an analyst's desk, and someone in the room hesitates before dismissing it too quickly. Humans have railguns. It began as an incredulous question, spoken with disbelief by officers who could not accept that a species they had underestimated for years possessed a weapon capable of unraveling everything they thought they understood about power in this galaxy. It has become, in the years since, something closer to a solemn warning, a reminder passed quietly between analysts and officers who understand now, in a way the Compact never allowed itself to understand before, that the greatest danger any civilization faces is not the strength of its rivals, but its own stubborn refusal to imagine that strength might arrive in a form it never expected. I carry that warning with me every day, in every report I write and every young analyst I train, because I never again want to be the person standing quietly in a room full of people who refuse to listen, watching a warning I already understand to be true slowly, inevitably, become a catastrophe no one can undo.